All right, I think we're recording. Okay, so hi, I'm David Haldeman. I'm with Humanities Washington, and I'm very excited to have Michelle Janning, a professor of sociology at Whitman College and a member of Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau, where she presents a program called "What Your Home Says About the World." And this is a little experiment we're trying at Humanities Washington during the pandemic, and I don't know, maybe we can call it quarantine conversations. I don't know. But yeah, thanks. Thanks for joining us, Michelle. Really
My
appreciate it.
pleasure. It's nice to see you, David, and I look forward to our conversation about homes, which we're both sitting in, each of ours. Right
I
now.
actually, on my list of questions, I was wondering if you in particular, this is a great time for you because you're getting a peek into lots of people's homes that you might not ordinarily get.
Well, that's true, unless they're putting backgrounds that are actually representations of a false presentation of home, which of course we both know is happening. And I'm not talking necessarily about, the fun outer space Zoom backgrounds, but the ones where it's clearly meant to be a bedroom or living room space, but you're just not quite sure if that's actually theirs or if it's something from a stock photo list.
Is this a
So
phenomenon that's been happening?
what's that?
Is this a phenomenon that's actually been happening?
Well, sure, and I'm looking at this from my social media and news feeds about purchases that you can make of backgrounds. Also, if you watch TV, any of the specials that we've seen with artists, musicians, and other entertainers projecting their voice from their home spaces, it's quite clear that some of those backgrounds are not real. So this is me just guessing this is a thing.
I actually did at one point on Twitter see somebody get piled on because he had taken a background. I mean, like somebody had done a screenshot of a background that he had done a couple months previously, which looked like his actual home. And it was a very wealthy home. But in order to make himself seem more connected to the people or whatever, he had actually put in a sort of more a background that might indicate a more lower socioeconomic status. And somebody discovered this and completely dumped on it as a result. But
Yeah, so this is what I've been thinking about. We already think about our home spaces as having segments that are private and some that are a little more public. The kind of, if people come over to our houses, which hopefully, again, they can do someday, we have certain areas where we think that's okay for strangers to visit, or that's okay for non-family members to visit, or for, certain groups of people to visit, or work colleagues or something like that. So we've already got this practice of separating spaces in our home into more and less public. What we have now is this really interesting moment where people not only are doing that, but they get to decide whether they want to present what's real or not. And in some ways that can feel a little bit disingenuous. The person you're talking about could be evaluated as, why don't you just be honest? But I understand what they're trying to do. It could also be kind of a creative possibility. I was on a call with my nephew who works in the business world in Chicago. He and his wife are sharing a very small apartment. They're doing great, but they both have hectic business. And he chooses backgrounds where if he's meeting one-on-one with a person, he has an office cubicle background. If he has a group meeting, he has a boardroom background. And I think that's great. So it's a way to sort of set the mood or the tone creatively, depending on the purpose of the conversation, whether it's personal, work, a small group, one-on-one, large group, things like that.
And it's interesting too to think about job interviews as well. So if you are looking for a job right now, which clearly many people are, your interviewer is getting a really intimate look into these spaces in your house. And you may have an incentive to present a background or an image that speaks to a different set of values or a different socioeconomic status or something than you might already have. And the technology is allowing us to do that. But it's also being partly done out of necessity because so many of us are now out of work. But yeah, this is a very strange time to be having some of these conversations.
You know, the job interview question is great, David, because it's already been the case that we have accessories and props that we sort of need to use and wear and embody in order to give off a good impression. What I think is happening now is that set of material objects, that kind of set of accessories is now like a little universe of other accessories, including home decor objects that we might as well just tape to our forehead as as we walk into a job interview setting. So the possibility of being evaluated above and beyond your body and your clothing for any situation, job interviews, you know, student presentations that they might be doing in high schools and colleges, even kind of performance reviews for jobs that people already have. This is something that has kind of expanded the universe of objects by which we are evaluated about our success, for sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This is just fascinating. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you in particular during this time, is because so many of us are spending times inside of our homes. And there's this strange new world where we're able to adapt our backgrounds and and the technology to these particular times. So I guess if we could back up a little bit, I wanted to get into, I'll start with a quote from you, which I really like. "I'm not a social scientist who uses large national data sets to illustrate family life. I'm the social scientist who asks people to examine what's in their underwear drawers to tell stories about their family life." So I kind of wanted to back up and talk about that a little bit, because in essence, so how do you describe the work you do?
The work I do is, I'm a sociologist, which means that I systematically study human group behavior and make that study about observations and conversations that then I look for patterns within. But the work I do goes beyond sociology, which of course is already very vast in its approach as a discipline. We do look at large demographic data sets and try to understand big patterns, epidemiological and otherwise. But we also look at what we would call the micro-sociological level, the kind of everyday experience people have in small group interactions, as well as even kind of what goes on cognitively that might be informed by the social context in which we're operating. So what I try to do is take elements from those kind of levels of analysis and connect what I ask with other fields of study that include anthropology, which of course is a discipline that focuses more on the qualitative dimensions of ritual and material culture and entire groups of people, at least historically. I borrow also ideas from consumer studies. Why do we buy what we buy? Not just psychologically, you know, of course we're all drawn to certain products and have certain tendencies, but what does that say about our group memberships, including class and gender and things like that? And then finally, you know, the ways in which colleagues from all different disciplines study the impact of technology, science and technology studies, in particular, human-computer interaction studies and computer science. Those are also fields of study that inform what I do. And to me, I guess if I was to boil down, you know, what do I do, is I try to combine the data, you know, the numbers and the patterns with the stories that people share that highlight what the larger story looks like on a kind of on the ground everyday level. So what your current curtains look like might be about the manufacturing of curtains in the industrial, you know, capitalist West and labor issues, but they might also be about the aesthetic choices you make based on your relationship with your mom. It's all of that.
So you know, obviously one of your biggest focuses is about the stuff in the home, of which you've written a book about. How do you define a home object? You have a sort of spectrum here where clearly a lamp is a home object, is a piece of PVC piping in the walls a home object as well. How do you define it?
Yeah, the answer answer to that is they both are. I'm interested not just in the kind of hidden infrastructure of houses, the materials we use, the building products, the piping, like you said. In fact, I actually connect sociology to plumbing, because our job precisely as social scientists is to look at what's behind the walls and talk about whether it's working or not. So I really like the idea of plumbing pipes as being an important home object. But more often than not, when I've given talks through Humanities Washington, and when I write and actually interview people and survey them, what I'm really more interested in are objects that people attach meaning to, and then also objects where they may attach meaning, and they hope everybody else in their family also does, and then sometimes conflicts ensue when those two things are not matched. So I really, really like, this vase, maybe, and maybe it was something I got from a grandparent, and my son may have no interest in it, and then our relationship is impacted by our attachment to, in varying degrees, this object. Luckily, I don't care about this space, but you can imagine ways where something somebody cares about a lot and another person doesn't can lead to a strain on the relationship. So I talk about the meaning people attach to objects, the structure of our homes in terms of materials that we have that connote taste and access and wealth or not, and the relationship impacts of our attachment of meaning to these objects.
So how did you come to be interested in this particular field? Like, what was your personal story with objects, with home objects?
I think it stemmed from a childhood love of aesthetics. I spent a lot of my childhood, in addition to wanting to be a veterinarian because I love animals, which passed by the time I think I was 7 or 8. I've always been interested in the study of design and aesthetics, and as a teenager subscribed to home decor magazines instead of teen magazines, and then went to college thinking maybe something along the lines of political science and law and international studies, but always with the feel towards connection to our material world. And I ended up kind of figuring that out academically by ending up in sociology and anthropology as a combined major. And then in graduate school, I learned that within sociology, there's a subfield called cultural sociology, which I think does a very good job relative to some of the other subfields of saying the meaning we attach to objects and our values that are connected to that are a worthy area of study within sociology itself. And so we can look at an art object. We can look at the production of this object and the network of people who produce it. We can look at taste and whether people have access to fancy things or not fancy things, and how we evaluate each other along those lines. So my story started personally. I still love decorating, and I love thinking about the meaning attached to objects. I made these curtains. I refinished that cabinet behind us, right? So the love I have is both personal and professional. I'm just grateful I found some academic areas of study to give me a vocabulary and framework to ask questions of other people as well. It's not just my story, of course, that I'm interested in.
Yeah. So obviously there's been an explosion of material goods in the past century, more than a century. How has our relationship to this stuff, and particularly this consumer goods, this stuff in our home, how has that changed over the past century?
I think if you look at change in the goods in our homes, you have to also take into consideration larger social patterns that reflect change as well. So geographic mobility, for example, among people who are in our 40s and younger, especially, the assumption that our jobs will carry with it, well, less now, but will carry with it travel, and will carry with it the notion of promotion and movement for professional managerial class individuals especially, would suggest that the purchase of heavy heirloom furniture that's difficult to move might be a little bit less likely. So I think job patterns and mobility matter. I think the notion of political views about whether we ought to spend money on things or not, and the role of capitalism and globalization in the marketplace matters as well. So you see maybe a historical movement pendulum towards buying a lot of things and building, small mansions and furnishing them with a lot of pieces of furniture that look opulent and expensive, and then a pendulum shift back towards something maybe more minimalistic as a response to that. And so the idea of buy things to make our economy good, don't buy things to make yourself, your mental health good. All of these things are larger patterns that I think affect everything, from what Kleenex box we choose to whether we buy a new couch or not. If you add on top of that just the ways that the kind of furniture industry has changed and some of the entrepreneurial online ways that you can order a couch to be built for you, the notion of IKEA and companies like that making it more affordable for people, and therefore furniture that may be a little bit more disposable, to put it the ways some other people have done, are also kind of following this pattern of demographic trends. So that's just a few ideas. Of course, it's very complex.
One of the weird ironies right now, and I mean, I guess you may be more familiar with the data on this, is particularly among perhaps more liberal sort of wealthy households, it's almost considered passé to display wealth. So you end up having these homes that are almost weirdly, eerily minimalist, where you have like a coffee table and a vase and an architecture magazine and nothing else. Whereas in the old days, if you were wealthy, you wanted to say, hello, I'm wealthy. Is that sort of what you're talking about in terms of the demographic, some of the recent demographic shifts?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a great point, that the display of wealth via home objects and other material representations, including clothing, have been interesting to sociologists for centuries, actually. Even in the 1800s, some social theorists like George Simmel were writing about fashion and its representation of social class. So this is definitely something we've looked at. Minimalism is interesting, as is the kind of Marie Kondo phenomenon of getting rid of your stuff. What I like to point out are journalists and scholars who have written this. I haven't written this necessarily, but who've written about the fact that you need to have wealth in order to downsize or minimize what you have. There's something about being in a precarious situation, economically especially, that makes the decision to get rid of something feel very different. I have a feeling, I mean, our world is going through something collectively traumatic when it comes to our capacity to build wealth and buy things, obviously. And that inequality, that gap is going to get bigger. It already is. I'm seeing it in my own town with people losing businesses and jobs. So it's going to be interesting to see whether people are reluctant to get rid of stuff later on in a year or two because of the fact that we're going through kind of a precarious time of we're not sure we're going to be able to get something new. What I would say is the minimalism as a decorating trend, first of all, has to do with globalization and the dispersal of that aesthetic as being popular among designers themselves. But also, I think it has to do with the kind of, I can afford to get rid of stuff. And to do that, actually, maybe ironically, is a display of wealth. Yeah. Is a display of elite status to walk into a sparse, minimally decorated living room, especially if you know the people ahead of time and understand their social position. But to do that, it would be pretty easy to assume that there's something going on where they are allowed to make that decision to get rid of stuff. Yeah. That's what I would say.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And I mean, are you familiar with the research that goes into how stuff affects us psychologically? So if we're in a room that has a large number of objects, that, does organization matter, disorganization? Is it sheer quantity? What does stuff do to us psychologically?
Well, I'm not a psychologist, but I do think it's important to look at individual differences, or maybe I should say where our starting points are for looking at a room that has a lot of stuff in it. And what I would like to offer is that there's a lot of variation in people's starting points about whether a room full of furniture feels comforting or uncomfortable. And I think it can go either way. And that might have something to do with people's personalities. It might have something to do with their backgrounds. I do a lot of stuff with home and work boundaries. And I think it's safe to say that, you and I maybe would be different points along the spectrum of how integrated our work and family lives are. Like maybe I've got my laptop spread out and I've got work stuff all over my bedroom. I'm very integrated. Some people are more interested in separating these realms and feel like their life realms need to have compartments to make them feel sane, to make them feel organized and things like that. So first I'll say there's individual variation. It isn't the case that one group over the other is more likely to say, pile these 10 sofas in our living room, it'll make everybody happy. But we do have individual differences. In terms of, is that good for us or not? I think what I tend to do is I tend to take a step back and don't go to the place of, is it good for you or not? I look at the outcomes that result from sort of overdoing the material that tell the story. So I look at TV shows like Hoarders or the Marie Kondo phenomenon as evidence that our society has decided there's something pathological about having too much stuff. The pathology of it takes many different forms, though. Some people would talk about it as a mental health issue, and certainly shows like Hoarders that basically say you're ill if you have too much of one thing or too many different things, and it will hurt your health, mental and physical. But I also think I hear messages of environmentalism and overconsumption that's bad for our planet and our landfills. And I also hear stories about value systems, especially when it comes to parents and children, about materialism. So the notion of, is this good or bad for us, is interesting to me, but where I go is, how is that good or bad framing being connected to particular topics? Is it framed as a mental health issue? Is it framed as, which of course psychologists would do? Is it framed as an environmental issue, which of course people who are in green and sustainability movements might do? Is it framed as materialism, which people are interested in the impact of parent-child interaction would do? So my answer to your question is not helpful because I don't have a, it's bad or good for you to have 10 sofas in your living room. I'm not gonna answer that, because it's interesting to me only in terms of who's framing that pathology, why, what do they get out of it, and are we sure it's all just about psychology? It's got to be both, right?
Yeah. And I mean, it would be interesting. And again, yeah, you're not a psychologist, and I'm obviously not, but you brought up the issue with work and the workspace. Mm-hmm. And I know for me personally, I want to keep things in one very specific environment that I associate with work. And I'm very lucky. I have a modest house that I can kind of come back into a room and do my work there. And when I shut the door, I'm gone. Mm-hmm. However, my wife tends to like to work in different spots in the house. I couldn't do it. I think it would be really difficult. And there is, to my mind, a psychological cost to associating different objects like a couch or art on the walls with sitting on my laptop in the living room. It all blends together for me. Mm-hmm. So being in this room is, more or less where I work and do a few other things. So it can definitely be challenging. But I guess one thing in this conversation is, at what point did materialism or a questioning of materialism start to creep into the national conversation? So Marie Kondo obviously has really resonated in the culture right now. A questioning of materialism has been present for several decades.
Right.
My perception, of course, is that in the 40s, 50s, 60s, materialism was, hey, everybody, just let's go, buy everything you possibly can. At what point did that start to shift? Has a questioning of materialism always existed, but it kind of got drowned out in the 50s and 60s? How do you trace the history of it?
That's great. And I would welcome any, American historian who watches this to email me and correct everything that I am about to say. But the idea of simplicity and modesty and presentation of yourself and wealth in ways that connote kind of a high moral virtue is part of the founding of the United States. So I think that the idea of how we use our objects to portray ourselves to others, to adhere to values that go way beyond our families, that's always been here. And that's been in every place we're talking about. It's not just a US focused thing. But I do think you're right that there's sort of this post-World War II was an interesting time of a kind of idealization of spending and showing success, because it had a lot to do with political and economic rhetorical strategies of the time. The notion of, first of all, we need to make sure that the home becomes the place that we've always wanted it to be, that it's safe and secure and wealthy, that we're not going back to where we were at this time of tremendous trauma, which of course is making me think of how design is going to be impacted a couple of years from now, honestly. And so the idea of buy because it's American is definitely part of that mid-century value system. And I think if you look at any part of the second half of the 20th century with social disruptions, change, economic instability, and then a resurgence of focus on wealth, maybe in the 80s, our buying of furniture followed right along with that trajectory, I think. What's interesting to me now is when people think about family heirlooms and what era they might be from and what they represented when they were first purchased or given, and what they represent now might mark a shift. Yeah, and I also think you see a proliferation of excess with people having too much stuff, and the kind of storage stall service industry expanding to kind of hold all the stuff. It kind of goes along with that as well.
Yeah. So when I feel like I don't know, I have an unusually potent sort of example of the difficulty of heirlooms, because this is my grandmother's house. We bought my grandmother's house about 5 years ago after she moved into assisted living, and she passed away a couple years ago, shortly after moving out. And what ended up happening is all of her stuff was here. I mean, all of it. Everything from couches to letters and correspondence to old photographs. And I think the most difficult example, I found in a desk drawer some tissue paper. Inside the tissue paper were 3 braids of hair. So intact braids of hair. One from my grandmother, and one from her sister, my great aunt, and another from their sister, who died in a snowstorm on her way to a hospital when she was 14 years old. She had an appendicitis and she passed away. I have no connection whatsoever to this woman, who would have been my great aunt. But there's this intense feeling of tragedy behind it and a sense of obligation. But at the same time, what do you do? And I mean, I know that you deal with this all the time, right? Like this is one of these questions that everybody has to grapple with individually. But I guess I bring this up because in your research, is there a general piece of advice, or what have you tended to see brings the most sort of happiness or at least contentment in terms of people keeping objects that have memories attached or family importance?
I think the happiest stories I hear, and this comes mostly in conversations I have with people after I've given a talk. Those are some of the richest moments of kind of story collecting that really bring to life strategies and challenges that people face with the exact kind of situation you're talking about. Although more often I hear about people who have objects where there is still somebody alive who really wants them to cherish it, and they have to kind of figure out how to save it, store it, display it when that person comes to visit and things. Your story is a little different in that there's this kind of ghost of a requirement to save it because it's supposed to somehow preserve a family story.
Yeah.
And in my research on love letters, where I look at how people whether they decide to save them or store them or curate them in interesting ways or burn them because they don't want anybody to see them. What I find with those stories is the people who kind of clearly know why they do or don't save something, and are decisive about it, and the people in their world understand that and honor it, those are the happier moments, right? So, and some of that might be an internal wrestling, right? If you decide to get rid of those, you will have to go through the energy or the work, really, of that deliberation and saying, it's okay for me to do this. Maybe you make a ritual of it, and you document the ritual as part of the family story. It's up to you to decide whether that version of the family story has as much meaning as the braids that are in the desk drawer that you're worried about getting rid of. My point is, understand ourselves and what our preferences are, step one. Step two, be able to communicate those to somebody else. And the step three, which is the sociology part, is understand where somebody else's viewpoint might be coming from that has to be situated not just in their personality or their crankiness or their pickiness or their individual views, but also their social groups, the era in which they grew up, the neighborhoods and social groups in which they grew up, and things like that. And this is where the arguments about my daughter doesn't want my dishes kind of comes to a head, where it feels like a dishonoring of the family story in some ways. There isn't a consistently amazing solution for everybody, because some people, they just decide, I'm going to do what I want, and it doesn't matter what the other person thinks, and then you have an argument about it, or you don't, and you move on. For some people, they keep the objects until the person who really wants it to be kept is no longer alive. That story happens. But I think what I'm thinking about with your story is a decision that you would have to make about what would hold meaning, right? So first of all, you have the value of having meaning attached to this story about your family. You just told it to me, right? And it obviously is a moving story. It's important, and it's where you came from. Do you need to have the material object to have that story be part of your life? Do you need to have that story be part of another person's life who's in your family or not? Those are the deliberations that I think are healthy for people to think about for themselves, maybe even write about. And then the dilemma becomes, would you digitize it? Is that good enough? Is a picture of the braids good enough compared to the actual braids themselves? And for some people, the answer is yeah. Digitizing things actually preserves them better because, I don't know, otherwise it gets burned up in a fire or something like that. For other people, digitizing something feels way less personal and because they may not have experienced the kind of digital preservation of things, or they might be, rightly so, worried about privacy and access and ownership of the objects, which we know matters for cloud storage and things like that. So I could go on and on about that, but for now, good luck with your decision about the hair.
Well, so the decision actually ended up getting made because, you know, basically going back to something that you had mentioned of a ritual, where I came to the decision that I know this story, right? So I understand the story, I know it, but I couldn't bring myself to have these strands of human hair just sitting in a drawer because, again, I don't have this connection. But saying, I kind of said a goodbye to it in a way. I just took a moment and I ended up donating them to Locks of Love. And I think that pause, that sort of brief honoring of the story and the event was enough for me to be able to feel okay about letting them go. And, you know, this was something that Marie Kondo brings up, right, is this sort of, for the objects you want to get rid of, take a moment to simply say thanks. And I never thought that I never thought I'd be somebody who did that, but I really found it, I found it kind of cathartic, and also just a way to appreciate what you have.
Yeah.
Because I think that I think particularly among younger generations, we see material objects, particularly heirlooms, as a major burden. You know, we want our own style. We want our own stuff. You know, I think, and we often want it cheaply. We don't want something following. If we have an heirloom table that we get in our early 20s, we don't necessarily want to know it's going to follow us into, you know, onto our you know, our deathbed, basically. And so there's this sense of a burden, but with that sense of a burden comes, I think, an excessive backlash against appreciation, just saying, well, it's just a table. Well, it's just a glass. Well, it's just a vase. And so there's a middle ground there. And I think for me, the middle ground has been trying to just pause. If I'm going to give something away, just say thanks. And I found that to be a strangely potent way of appreciating what I got.
Yeah, I mean, what you've gone through, first of all, people older than us also have gone through the, I don't want what my parents have, and it needs to be cheap, and I'm not buying this because I think I'm going to pass it on to my kids. Just ask my mom, right? When their furniture was, you know, in the 1960s, they're like, I don't want to have anything to do with this old oak table, by the way, which is right in my dining room. But what I will say is that the thing you're talking about, this ritual, is highly functional, both at an individual and a collective level. That what that does, and maybe it's that you burn something, maybe it's that you give it to a museum, or you try to. You know, I've had people, I had a woman send me the love letters that she couldn't get a museum to hold on to, and she didn't have any children or grandchildren, but she knew that if they went to me, they had the story that would honor them, and that was good enough for her well-being to think about them, to think about this cultural biography of this object as having a next life, to honor that story. And that can be very therapeutic at an individual level, so that you understand the transition of that object from, you know, it's yours to somebody else's, but the story is still there.
Yeah.
Think about how that matters at the collective level for museum curators, for historical exhibits, for understanding how do we tell the story, how do we tell this pandemic story with objects, how do we choose those, how do we decide you know, what everyday objects versus special objects might be worth saving to kind of connote this collective story. I think we're going to have that deliberation on a larger level, like you're having about, like you have had with the individual story of the hair. But that switching an object from it was mine to somebody else's isn't just about getting rid of it. And it might be the Marie Kondo stuff really gloms onto a kind of spiritual element of it. But I would also add, it also could just be changing the definition of the object preserves the story that aligns with my values. You know, if the hair goes on, my story is part of something important, and who doesn't want to feel like that, right?
Right. So I'm getting a little mindful of your time, but I'll just ask, I think, one or two more questions.
Okay.
So with so many of us being in quarantine for weeks, well, at this point, months probably, do you think our relationship to our stuff might change?
Probably. We might, well, first of all, our houses are dirtier, right? Because we're all living in them. And so our relationship to our stuff will change insofar as our labor attached to maintaining the stuff is changing. And this isn't just because of people not being able to say, hire somebody to come clean their house, because we're not supposed to do that if people can afford it. But it also is sort of a noticing. You know, we see the dirt when we're at home more, and we also have to divide the labor attached to that dirt, and the dirt has increased. So that's what I will say first, is we're around our objects more, and we have to maintain them when we're using them more. Running the dishwasher more, bathroom more, vacuuming more, buying more toilet paper, right? All of that stuff. So I think that's true. I think that okay, so you said that you are better off if you have a separate space to do your work, and that to have it be dispersed in multiple rooms at different times is problematic for you, whereas your wife is better, more comfortable with that. I think for people, this is a guess, but I think for people who like to have the sort of separate realms, where there's a place in their home that they've had to define as their workspace, that space will forever be changed in definition in their minds. And so 2 years go by, hopefully less, you're back in an office, and you come home and you're in the room where you're sitting right now, your memories aren't just going to be, this is the extra space or whatever it was. Your memories are going to be, this is where I actually did most of my job for weeks and weeks and weeks. And for some people, that might be an invigorating memory. For some people, it might be very stressful. You know, I'm sitting in my dining room, and so we've turned this space into a multi-purpose in ways we've never done before. And it is the case that when I walk by this table on the way from the living room to the kitchen, I think about work. And I didn't do that as much as I do now. So I think that the way we are relating to our spaces and our objects, because they've become more intimately connected with paid labor, later on, if that goes away, the memory of those things is going to stay. And then the other part, of course, just material objects include clothing. So the idea of, like, you know, wearing slippers and pajama pants on the bottom half of what you're doing can also make us think about our clothing differently. I really like to wear professional clothing, and I kind of miss my blazers, right? If I could put it that way, I kind of miss those. And so the idea of a longing for an object that we feel like connotes our sense of self, displayed to others or even just internally, has changed because we've had to do that. Like this morning, I put on a blazer and I'm like, oh, it's a fancy day in my dining room because I'm having this conversation with you. So yeah, those are a few examples I can think of.
This is the first time I've worn a button-down shirt in several weeks, easily. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
It's often t-shirts and hoodies at this point, which does, I mean, you know, you associate certain objects with productivity. And I think that I wonder if you measured how much I get done today by wearing this. I'd be curious if there's some uptick, you know, because we are infusing these objects with meaning, and they may just have this sort of psychological, they may give you a little bit of a boost.
Yeah, and importantly, you know, you and I are in professions where we get to choose to do this or not, right? Yeah. We don't have uniforms. We don't have to leave our house to do our job as an essential worker or otherwise. And so it's in a lot of ways a privilege to be able to step back and say, I miss my button-down shirt and my blazer, and I get to wear it, and I wonder if that'll affect my productivity. And to have the capacity to even think about that. That's certainly a luxury that I'm really grateful for. But I would want us to think about ways where limited space and limited flexibility with time and objects, which of course disproportionately affects people in terms of socioeconomic class on the lower end of the SES spectrum, it affects people differently for sure.
I guess my last question, are there any objects in a home that you think speak more loudly than others in terms of a family's overall identity or socioeconomic class, or are there objects you particularly gravitate to that are more data rich?
No, I don't think there are, and I say that because I don't study the objects themselves. I see what people say about them and how they talk about their meaning. And so because I make the argument that we construct the meanings attached to objects, that means that somebody I might talk to really talks a lot about their couch, and another person I talk to really talks a lot about a photograph. And the couch and the photograph are equally important, but they're just defined as important. Different kinds of objects are defined as important by different people. It is the case, though, that I don't go into people's homes and then analyze it and try to figure things out. They're always afraid that I do, but I don't. And if I do, I keep it to myself. But is it the case that I can tell how much chairs cost, at least within a certain range? Sure. But I'm, not as well as an interior designer might be able to, for example. So to me, it's more about the stories that people decide are attached to objects. And I'd like to offer that we ought to have flexibility with that. And to say that this couch isn't meaningful isn't up to me to decide. To say that a photograph is meaningful isn't up to me to decide. I do think, though, having said that, if I was to look at the kinds of things that people are most attached to, the ones that really have a poignant story or a face or a name of a person that matters to them really, really are likely to be part of those stories. So if a grandparent built that couch and their name is etched on the underside, That matters maybe more than if it's just a couch you bought on sale. And so the attachment to people by name, face, or marker or story becomes the kinds of stories that I hear the most, I'd say.
Great. Well, this has been fantastic. I really, really appreciate your time. I'm excited for you to be able to get back on the road again and start giving this presentation again.
Me too.
And more stories. Yeah. So, yeah. But anyway, Michelle Janning, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Humanities Washington. Thanks, David. I hope everybody's doing well and looking at your home objects in new, interesting ways.
Absolutely. And thanks to this, even more new, interesting ways.
Great.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, take care.
Bye.